They were selling an obese widow and a baby when a mountain man rode up and said, "I'll give you a home." The crowd laughed, the saloon keeper sneered, and the church bell tolled like judgment on her soul. A woman cast aside like cattle, a baby about to be torn from her arms. But this wasn't just pity. Hidden in her late husband's papers is a secret one that could control the valley's water and decide who lives or dies on the frontier. Now the widow everyone mocked must fight not only for her child, but for landmen would kill to steal. And the mountain man who saved her, he carries scars of his own and a vow he's not sure he can keep. When the deputy rides up with forged papers and the ranchers set fire to their barn, the question burns hotter than the flames. Will faith and love be enough to protect a mother, a baby, and the last hope for justice in this town? Before we begin, send a quick wave in the comments. Tell me your city, your country, your vibe. It's amazing how stories like this echo across the world. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the trading post, casting long shadows across the dusty yard where a crowd had gathered. The sound of cruel laughter mixed with the creak of wooden boards beneath shuffling feet. Martha Jane Callahan stood trembling, her infant daughter pressed close against her chest, wrapped securely in a faded cotton blanket. Sweat trickled down her neck as she endured the mockery of the townsmen before her. "Come now, gentlemen," the saloon-keeper called out, his voice thick with false cheer. "Surely someone needs a fine worker. She comes with her own helper, though. It might take a few years before the little one's worth her feed." More laughter erupted, cutting Martha Jane like knives. She bowed her head, unable to meet the contemptuous stares. Her late husband's debts had stripped away everything. Their small homestead, their few possessions, and now her very dignity. The rough wooden platform beneath her feet seemed to sway as another wave of jeers washed over her. "2 bits," someone called out. "That's more than fair for such substantial help." "3 bits," another voice chimed in. "Though feeding her might break a man." Martha Jane clutched her baby tighter, feeling the infant squirm against her chest. Tears threatened, but she fought them back. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry, though her heart was shattering into pieces. The saloon-keeper grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. Now, boys, let's be fair. She's got 2 good arms for work, even if she is a mite heavy in the middle." A cloud of dust rose suddenly from the road leading into town. Through her tears, Martha Jane saw a lone rider approaching, his figure dark against the bright afternoon sky. The horse's hooves kicked up small puffs of dust with each step, and the crowd's attention shifted as the stranger drew near. The rider pulled his mount to a stop at the edge of the gathering. Martha Jane could see him clearly now, a weathered man with gray threading through his dark hair, a long scar marking one side of his face. His clothes were trail-worn but well-maintained, speaking of a man who lived rough but took care with his possessions. Silas Boone, someone in the crowd muttered, and the name rippled through the onlookers. The mountain man's reputation seemed to quiet even the boldest jokesters. Silas dismounted with the fluid grace of a man used to living in the saddle. His boots hardly stirred the dust as he stepped forward, his eyes taking in the scene before him. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried clearly across the suddenly silent yard. "I'll give you a home." 5 simple words, but they fell like thunder in the quiet. Martha Jane's heart skipped a beat as she stared at him, trying to read his expression. Was this another cruel joke? But his face held no mockery, only a steady determination that made her breath catch. The saloon-keeper recovered first, clearing his throat. "Now, Mr. Boone, we're conducting a proper—" "No, you ain't," Silas cut him off, his voice still quiet but with steel underneath. "You're making sport of a widow and her child, and it stops now." He stepped forward, reaching into his coat to pull out a leather pouch. The coins inside clinked softly as he tossed it to the saloon-keeper. that'll cover any debt she owes. Martha Jane watched, still clutching her baby, as Silas moved through the parting crowd to stand before her. His eyes met hers, and in them, she saw not pity or cruel humor, but something else. Understanding, perhaps, or kindness long buried under years of solitude. He held out his hand to her, weathered and strong. "My wagon's just down the road, ma'am, if you'll allow me." Martha Jane looked at his offered hand, then back at his face. In that moment, she had to choose: trust this stranger or remain at the mercy of the crowd. Her baby stirred again, making a soft sound against her chest. That tiny movement decided her. Whatever Silas Boone's intentions, they couldn't be worse than what she faced here. She placed her hand in his, feeling the calluses of his palm against her fingers. His grip was gentle, but firm as he helped her down from the platform. The crowd parted further as Silas led her away, his presence like a shield between her and their stares. A wagon waited at the edge of town, 2 steady mules hitched to it. As they walked toward it, Martha Jane felt the weight of staring eyes on her back. But for the first time that day, she stood straight. Whatever came next, at least she had escaped that cruel auction block, and her baby was still safe in her arms. The wagon wheels creaked steadily as Silas guided the mules along the winding trail through the pine-covered foothills. Martha Jane sat beside him, her baby bundled close, watching the late afternoon shadows stretch across the rocky ground. The steady clip-clop of hooves and the gentle sway of the wagon filled the quiet between them. Martha Jane stole glances at her rescuers. Weathered profile. The scar that ran down his cheek looked silver in the fading light. His hands held the reins loosely, speaking of years of experience. Though his presence was imposing, she sensed no meanness in him, no hint of the cruelty she'd faced in town. The baby stirred, making small fussy sounds, and Martha Jane gently patted her back. "Hush now, little one," she whispered. Silas cleared his throat. "Not much further," he said, his voice rough but gentle. "Stream's just past those trees ahead." The trail curved around a stand of towering pines, and Martha Jane caught her first glimpse of what would be her new home. A log cabin stood in a small clearing, its sturdy walls golden in the evening light. A thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney, disappearing into the darkening sky. A clear stream bubbled past one side of the clearing, its banks lined with wildflowers. Silas brought the wagon to a stop near the cabin's front door. "It ain't much," he said, almost apologetically, "but it's warm and dry." The cabin was indeed modest, but Martha Jane saw the care in its construction, the tight-fitted logs, the well-maintained roof, the swept yard. After weeks of uncertainty following her husband's death, even this rough shelter felt like a blessing. Silas helped her down from the wagon, his strong hand steady as she managed her awkward descent. Inside, the cabin was simple but clean. A fire burned low in the hearth, and the air smelled of pine smoke and something savory cooking. "Made some venison stew this morning," Silas said, moving to tend the pot hanging over the fire. "Reckon you might be hungry." Martha Jane settled into a worn rocking chair near the hearth, cradling her daughter. The baby had fallen asleep during the journey, her tiny face peaceful in the firelight. The gentle motion of the rocker and the warmth of the fire began to ease some of the tension from Martha Jane's shoulders. Silas brought her a bowl of stew and a chunk of bread. The food smelled wonderful, but as she looked at it, the events of the day crashed over her. Tears welled up in her eyes and spilled down her cheeks. "Bought like cattle," she whispered, her voice breaking. "That's what I've come to." Standing there, while they bid on me like I was nothing but livestock, Silas knelt beside her chair, his face troubled. "No, ma'am," he said firmly. "That ain't what happened today. I gave those coins to stop their cruelty, not to buy you. You're as free as any person under God's heaven." He stood and moved to stoke the fire, giving her space with her emotions. This cabin's yours to use as long as you need. I'll sleep in the loft upstairs, and you can have the bedroom down here with the little one. Martha Jane wiped her eyes with her sleeve, studying his face in the firelight. There was nothing but honest concern in his expression, and something else, perhaps a shadow of old pain. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why help us?" Silas was quiet for a long moment, watching the flames. "Because it was right," he finally said. "And because no one should face the world alone." Later that night, after Silas had shown her to the small bedroom and climbed to the loft, Martha Jane knelt beside the narrow bed. Her daughter slept in a drawer padded with blankets, a makeshift cradle. "Lord," she whispered, "keep us safe in this place. And thank you for sending help when we needed it most." Above, through the rough planks of the floor, Silas lay awake in his bed, listening to the soft murmur of her prayer. The sound stirred memories he'd long tried to bury of another woman's voice in this cabin, of prayers shared and a life built together. His wife, Sarah, had been gone these 10 years, taken by fever despite all his desperate efforts to save her. The baby's quiet whimpers drifted up through the floorboards, followed by Martha Jane's gentle shushing. The sounds pierced Silas's solitude, reminding him of all he'd lost. But they awoke something else too, a protective instinct he'd thought long dead, a stirring of possibility he wasn't ready to name. He rolled onto his side, listening to the small sounds of mother and child settling below. The familiar ache of loneliness felt different somehow, touched with a warmth he barely remembered. Sleep was long in coming that night, as memories of the past and whispers of the future wrapped around him like smoke from the dying fire. Morning crept into the cabin as pale sunlight filtered through the wooden shutters. Martha Jane sat in the rocking chair, her practiced hands gentle as she nursed her daughter. The familiar motions brought comfort after yesterday's upheaval, grounding her in the simple necessity of caring for her child. From the kitchen area, the sharp scent of coffee mingled with the sizzle of flapjacks on the iron griddle. Silas moved with quiet efficiency, his large hands surprisingly deft as he worked. He glanced over at Martha Jane, noting how naturally she seemed to fit into the cabin's worn comfort, as if she'd always belonged there. "Breakfast ready," he said, setting 2 plates on the rough-hewn table. "Coffee's hot, too." Martha Jane settled the baby against her shoulder, patting gently. "Much obliged," she said softly. "It smells wonderful." After they'd eaten, Silas led her outside. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and wild sage. He showed her the creek that ran behind the cabin, its clear water tumbling over smooth stones. "Cut ice here in winter," he explained, pointing to a deeper pool. "Keeps through summer in the root cellar." He paused, watching as Martha Jane took in their surroundings. "Water's good for drinking, too. Never runs dry, even in drought." They walked to a small corral where a brown mule lifted its head to watch them. "That's Bessie," Silas said. "She's steady on mountain trails. Good for hauling supplies." Martha Jane nodded, but her thoughts seemed far away. She shifted the baby in her arms, gathering courage. "Mr. Boone," she began, then stopped. "Silas." He corrected gently. "Silas." She drew a deep breath. "There's something I need to tell you. Something important." They returned to the cabin, where Martha Jane retrieved a folded packet of papers from her skirts. Her hands trembled slightly as she spread them on the table. "My Henry," she said, voice catching on her late husband's name. "He filed a claim, before he died, for water rights on the river strip near town." She smoothed the wrinkled documents with careful fingers. "It's why the saloon keeper and those ranchers were so keen to get rid of me. Whoever controls that stretch of river controls water for half the valley's ranches." Silas pulled the lamp closer, studying the papers intently. His weathered face grew serious as he recognized the official stamps and signatures. These were legitimate documents, filed properly with the territorial office. "This is why they arranged that auction," he said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "They thought they could drive you out, claim abandonment of the water rights." Martha Jane nodded, clutching her baby closer. "I kept these hidden. They don't know I have them." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I was afraid to tell anyone, but I trust you, Silas. The Lord led me to trust you." Silas sat back, considering the weight of what she'd revealed. This wasn't just about offering shelter to a widow and child anymore. These water rights could determine the fate of every small rancher in the valley. In the wrong hands, they could be used to strangle independent homesteaders until they were forced to sell out Dot as evening approached. Silas built up the fire while Martha Jane prepared a simple supper. He'd been turning the situation over in his mind all day, and now his path was clear. "Those rights are yours," he said firmly. "Your husband filed them legal and proper. We'll defend them." He met her startled gaze across the firelight. "You and the little one belong here now, under my roof. Nobody's going to drive you out or steal what's rightfully yours." Tears welled in Martha Jane's eyes, but they weren't tears of fear this time. "Thank you," she whispered. "I've been so afraid, carrying this burden alone." "You ain't alone anymore," Silas replied, his voice rough with emotion. He looked around the cabin, at Martha Jane rocking her sleeping daughter, at the documents spread across his table. Something had shifted between them, a trust born of shared purpose and growing understanding that Martha Jane's revelation had changed everything. She wasn't just a vulnerable widow needing protection. She held the key to the valley's future in those carefully preserved papers. Silas recognized the responsibility that came with this knowledge, and he was ready to shoulder it alongside her Dot. As night settled over the cabin, the lamp's glow fell warm across the water rights documents, still lying on the table like a promise waiting to be kept. 2 days later, the wagon wheels creaked as Silas guided his team toward town, the morning sun warming their backs. Martha Jane sat beside him, her baby wrapped snugly in a shawl, while church bells rang in the distance. The whitewashed chapel stood small but proud against the mountain backdrop, its wooden cross catching the light Dot as they pulled up to the hitching post, heads turned. Martha Jane felt the weight of stairs pressing down on her shoulders. Whispers floated through the morning air like falling leaves. "That's the auction widow," one woman hissed behind her hand. "Living with that mountain man now," another added, voice thick with judgment. Silas helped Martha Jane down from the wagon, his calloused hands sure. She clutched her baby closer, drawing strength from the infant's warm weight against her chest. Together, they walked up the wooden steps and through the church doors. Dawn inside. Lamplight glowed on rough-hewn pews. Reverend Albright stood at his pulpit, Bible open before him, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners as he nodded welcome. Martha Jane settled into a back pew, grateful when Silas sat beside her, his solid presence a shield against the sideways glances. The Reverend's voice filled the small space as he began his sermon. "Today we speak of God's special care for the lowly," he announced, his words clear and strong. "For it is written that he raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap." Martha Jane felt tears sting her eyes. Her fingers trembled as she wiped them away, remembering her own time in the dust, how the Lord had sent Silas to lift her up. The baby stirred against her chest as she soothed her with gentle pats. After the final hymn faded, several women approached with offerings. Mrs. Peterson held out a fresh-baked loaf of bread, still warm from her oven. Old Widow Cooper brought a carefully folded quilt, its patches speaking of hours of loving work. "For the little one," Mrs. Cooper said softly, her weathered face kind. But not all faces showed kindness. From nearby, Martha Jane heard the cruel Whispers. Never seen such a size on a woman. Someone muttered. Poor mountain man's got his hands full. Before the words could slice deeper, Silas turned. His steady gaze found the speakers, and though he said nothing, his look carried weight. The whispers died away like smoke and wind. Outside the church, morning sun warmed the gathering crowd. A tall figure approached. Henry, the Ute scout, his dark eyes knowing as he greeted Silas with a slight nod. Martha Jane had heard of him. He worked with the government, bridging two worlds with careful wisdom. Long time, my friend, Henry said, his voice low and measured. I hear you've taken on a worthy cause. Silas nodded. This here's Martha Jane. And her little one. Henry's gaze shifted to the baby, then to Martha Jane. The water-claim widow, he said quietly. That river strip means much to many people. It's rightfully hers, Silas replied. Her husband filed proper. Henry's face grew serious. Papers can be forged. Officials can be bought. I've seen it before. He touched the silver band on his wrist, a gesture Martha Jane would later learn spoke of treaties made and broken. They'll try to take it one way or another. Much obliged for the warning, Silas said, understanding heavy in his voice. The ride home felt longer, the wagon swaying gentle over rutted roads. Martha Jane's baby fussed, tired from the morning's excitement. Without thinking, Martha Jane began to sing, her voice soft and sweet in the afternoon air. Hush now, my darling. Be still now and rest. The sun's riding low in the gold-painted west. The lullaby drifted out across the sage, carrying memories of her mother singing the same words years ago. Her voice shook slightly, but the melody held true. Silas kept his eyes on the road, but his heart caught at the simple beauty of her song. Something warm stirred in his chest, an awakening he hadn't felt since laying his wife to rest all those years ago. He found himself listening intently, letting the sweet notes wash over him like spring rain on thirsty ground. The baby's eyes drooped closed, soothed by her mother's voice. Martha Jane hummed the last few notes, then fell silent, though the song seemed to linger in the air between them. Ahead, the road wound toward home, while behind them, Henry's warning echoed like distant thunder. The water rights made Martha Jane a target, and dangerous times lay ahead. The morning sun crept over the mountains, painting the frost-covered ground in shades of gold. Inside the cabin, Martha Jane stood at the wood stove, her hands working with practiced ease as she mixed flour and buttermilk. The familiar motions brought comfort, even as her heart fluttered with uncertainty. Silas descended the ladder from the loft, pausing at the unexpected sight and smell of breakfast. Martha Jane had already stoked the fire and set the table with tin plates and cups. Thought I might make biscuits, she said softly, not meeting his eyes. To thank you for everything. The dough yielded beneath her fingers as she shaped it, trying not to think about how her size filled the small kitchen space. But her movements were sure and purposeful, born from years of experience. Silas watched as she worked, noting how naturally she handled the cooking. Smells mighty fine, he said, pouring coffee for them both. Soon, golden biscuits and thick gravy filled their plates. Martha Jane waited anxiously as Silas took his first bite. His eyes widened slightly, and a small smile crossed his weathered face. Best biscuits I've had since, well, in many years, he said quietly. After breakfast, Silas led Martha Jane outside to show her the daily tasks. The morning air bit sharp and clean as he demonstrated how to split kindling, his strong hands guiding the axe with practiced strokes. Like this, he said, showing her the proper angle. Let the weight of the blade do the work. Martha Jane tried, her movements hesitant at first. The axe felt strange in her hands, but she soon found a rhythm. Each successful split brought a small sense of accomplishment. At the creek, Silas showed her how to break through the thin ice for fresh water. creek runs deep here," he explained. "Won't freeze solid, even in winter." As they worked side by side, conversation came easier. The silence between words felt comfortable now, not heavy with awkwardness as before. During a rest near midday, Martha Jane sat on a log, her breath clouding in the cold air. "Sometimes," she said softly, "I feel like I take up too much space in the world, like I'm not worthy of kindness." Silas turned to her, his scarred face serious. "We all carry burdens," he said. "Mine just show on the outside." He touched the long scar that ran down his cheek, a reminder of a grizzly's claws. "Been lonely up here, truth be told. Since my Sarah passed, cabin's been mighty quiet." Martha Jane's baby cooed from her basket nearby, a sound bright in the winter air. Both smiled at the innocent noise. "I need to ride into town," Silas said. "After a while, check some things at the courthouse." "Will you be all right here?" Martha Jane nodded, surprising herself with how safe she felt at the cabin now. Silas rode through the afternoon, the sun casting long shadows by the time he reached town. At the courthouse, he carefully examined the land claim records, comparing dates and signatures. Everything appeared legitimate. Martha Jane's husband had filed properly, securing the water rights before his death. Dusk was falling when Silas returned, finding Martha Jane at the stove stirring a pot of beans. The cabin glowed with warmth and lamplight, so different from the cold emptiness he'd known for years. "The claim's solid," he said, hanging his coat by the door, "but we'll need to act fast to protect it. Those men in town won't wait long to make their move." Over supper, Martha Jane told stories of her childhood on a Kansas farm, and Silas shared tales of his early days in the mountains. When she described her first attempt at making pie, ending with flour covering every surface in her mother's kitchen, Silas chuckled. The sound surprised them both, and Martha Jane found herself laughing too, soft and genuine. Later, after Martha Jane had gone upstairs with the baby, her gentle humming of Amazing Grace drifted down through the floorboards. Silas sat in his chair by the fire, a piece of pine wood in his hands. His knife moved carefully, shaping the wood into a small spoon sized for tiny hands Dot as he carved. Silas realized something was changing in him. This cabin had been just shelter before, a place to weather storms and survive. Now, with each passing day, it was becoming something more. In helping Martha Jane, he'd found purpose again. In protecting her and her child, he was building not just walls against danger, but the foundations of a family. The wood shavings fell softly as he worked, and above, Martha Jane's hymn filled the quiet house with hope. The wagon wheels creaked over the rutted road as Silas guided the team toward town. Martha Jane sat beside him, clutching her papers close, while her baby dozed in a basket at her feet. Henry rode alongside on his pinto pony, his presence steady and reassuring in the crisp morning air. "Documents need proper filing," Henry said, gesturing toward the leather folder in Martha Jane's hands. "Good witnesses make strong cases." His dark eyes scanned the landscape, reading signs others might miss. The courthouse stood modest but proud, its whitewashed boards gleaming in the morning sun. Inside, worn floorboards groaned beneath their feet as they approached the clerk's desk. The man behind it looked up wearily, ink staining his fingers. "Water claim filing," Silas said, his voice quiet but firm. He placed Martha Jane's documents on the scarred wooden surface. The clerk adjusted his spectacles, examining the papers with practiced eyes. "Everything seems in order from the original claim," he said, reaching for his ledger. "Though transferring to a widow's name." He glanced at Martha Jane, then quickly away. Martha Jane stepped forward, her chin lifted despite her racing heart. "My husband filed honest and proper," she said. "I aim to honor his work." Henry nodded approvingly as the clerk began the careful process of recording the transfer. The scratch of his pen filled the quiet room as he wrote out Martha Jane's full name in flowing script. Witnesses? The clerk asked, looking up. I stand as one, Henry said, stepping forward. His voice carried the weight of his position as a polista. Government scout. And I'm another, Silas added firmly. The clerk nodded, recording their names. After what seemed like hours, he finally pressed his official seal into red wax at the bottom of the document. There now, he said, handing the papers back to Martha Jane. Properly filed and witnessed. Martha Jane's hands trembled slightly as she accepted them, but her voice was steady. Much obliged. They had barely stepped outside when a shadow fell across their path. Elias Crow stood there, his lean frame blocking the sunlight. Other men lingered behind him, watching. Well, well, Crow drawled, his eyes cold. If it ain't the auction widow, playing at being a property holder. His gaze raked over Martha Jane's size with deliberate cruelty. Ain't natural, a fat woman claiming river rights that honest ranchers need. Silas moved forward, placing himself between Crow and Martha Jane. The claims legal and witnessed, he said quietly. Best mind your words, Crow. Legal? Crow sneered. We'll see how legal it stands when tested. He spat in the dust at their feet, the gesture full of contempt. This ain't over. He turned sharply and stalked away, his boot heels striking the wooden sidewalk like hammer blows. Martha Jane's face burned with shame and anger, but she held herself straight as they made their way back to the wagon. Henry mounted his pinto, scanning the street with careful eyes as they started the journey home. The afternoon sun was sinking by the time they reached Silas's cabin. Martha Jane's hands still shook slightly as she prepared supper, the weight of Crow's threats heavy in her mind. After the baby was settled for the night, Silas found Martha Jane sitting by the fire, her eyes distant. He settled into his chair. Across from her, the flames casting flickering shadows on the walls. My mama used to read scripture, he said softly, breaking the silence. One verse always stuck with me. The Lord lifts up the humble. His voice grew gentle. You stood proud today, Martha Jane. Showed more courage than most. Martha Jane wiped a tear from her cheek. Some days it's hard to feel worthy of standing at all, she whispered. Worth ain't measured by what others see, Silas replied. It's measured by what's in here. He touched his chest. And you've got more heart than any of them townfolk. They sat quietly for a while, watching the flames dance. Finally, Martha Jane rose to help Silas close the shutters against the growing dark. Neither noticed the lone rider watching from the shadows of the pine trees, his horse standing patient and still-dot as they secured the last shutter. Martha Jane paused. Thank you, she said softly, for standing with me today. Silas nodded, understanding in his eyes. Ain't no one fighting. This battle alone, he answered. Not anymore. Sunday morning dawned bright and cold, frost glittering on the wagon seat as Silas helped Martha Jane climb up. The baby, bundled warmly against her chest, cooed softly as they set out for church. Martha Jane sat straighter this week, her shoulders squared despite her size. The memory of filing her claim gave her strength. Even as her heart fluttered at what reception awaited, the little white church glowed in the morning light, its bell calling the faithful. Martha Jane smoothed her clean, but worn dress as she stepped down from the wagon. Whispers still followed her path to the door, but she lifted her chin, remembering Silas's words about worth inside, the familiar sense of wood polish and lamp oil wrapped around them. Martha Jane settled into a pew, the baby quiet in her arms. Silas sat beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. When the congregation rose to sing, Martha Jane's voice joined them, trembling at first but growing stronger. After the service, Mrs. Albright, the preacher's wife, approached with a warm smile. Her gray hair was tucked neatly beneath a modest bonnet, her eyes kind behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Mrs. Callahan," she said, touching Martha Jane's arm. "We're starting our winter quilting circle this Thursday. Would you join us?" She glanced at the baby. "Little ones are always welcome." Martha Jane's eyes widened. I'd be honored, ma'am." The invitation was more than just quilting. It was acceptance, respectability. During the fellowship hour, coffee steamed in tin cups as townspeople mingled. Martha Jane found herself drawn into conversation with other women, sharing recipes and baby tales. Their initial stiffness melted slowly, like frost in morning sun. Across the room, Henry appeared at Silas's elbow, his expression grave. "Need." "Words," he murmured, guiding Silas toward a quiet corner. "Crow's been busy," Henry said low, glancing around. "Spending nights at the saloon, filling men's ears with talk. Claims he's got bills of sale that predate the widow's claim." He shook his head. "False papers, but men listen when whiskey flows." Martha Jane, passing nearby with her baby, caught the words. Her hands began to shake so badly she nearly dropped her cup. She steadied herself against the wall, fear closing her throat. Silas saw her distress and moved quickly to her side. "Won't let them take what's rightfully yours," he promised, his voice fierce but quiet. "Law's on your side, and so are we." The ride home was quiet, each lost in thought. As afternoon settled around the cabin, Martha Jane busied herself with supper preparations, humming softly to keep her spirits up. The familiar work of kneading bread helped calm her nerves. Later, as shadows lengthened across the floor, Martha Jane sat in her rocking chair by the fire. The baby lay content in her lap, playing with a wooden spoon Silas had carved. Without thinking, Martha Jane began singing an old hymn her mother had taught her. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. Her voice filled the cabin, clear and sweet. Silas looked up from cleaning his boots, something softening in his weathered face. On the second verse, his deep voice joined hers, rough but true. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, their voices twined together, filling the warm space with harmony. The baby watched them both, her tiny face bright with interest. Suddenly, she let out a laugh, her very first, a burble of pure joy that stopped them both mid-verse. Martha Jane's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, did you hear that?" Silas nodded, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "Reckon she's giving her approval of our singing." The baby laughed again, kicking her feet, and Martha Jane found herself laughing too. For a moment, the room felt full of light and warmth, the threats from town far away. She looked up to find Silas watching her, his expression tender in a way that made her heart skip. Neither spoke of what passed between them in that look, but something shifted, like earth after spring thaw. They finished the hymn together, voices gentler now, while the baby drifted to sleep in the fireht dot as night drew in. Silas made his usual rounds of the cabin. He checked the rifle kept above the door, making sure it was loaded and clean. Each window shutter was tested, each door bolt secured. The ritual was familiar, but tonight his movements held extra care. The winter wind had picked up, making the pine boughs dance and creak. As Silas stood at the last window, a sound caught his ear, the distant rhythm of hoofbeats carried on the wind. He stayed still, listening hard, but the sound faded into the night's whispers. Martha Jane's voice drifted down from upstairs, where she was settling the baby. "Good night, Silas, and thank you for everything." "Sleep well," he called back softly, his hand resting on the cold window frame. Outside, darkness pressed against the glass, and somewhere in that darkness, trouble was brewing. Snow began falling early Monday morning, fat flakes drifting past the cabin windows. Martha Jane watched them while kneading bread dough, her hands covered in flour. The baby slept nearby in a wooden cradle, Silas had brought down from the loft. The crunch of hooves in fresh snow made her look up. Through the frosted glass, she saw Henry riding up on his paint horse, snow dusting his shoulders. Silas opened the door before he could knock. "Come in, friend. Weather's turning fierce." Henry stamped snow from his boots and entered, his face grave. Bad news couldn't wait. He accepted the cup of coffee Martha Jane offered, warming his hands around it. "Crow's been busy. Seen him yesterday, passing coins to Deputy Thorne behind the livery." Martha Jane's hands stilled in the dough. "The deputy?" Henry nodded. "That ain't all. They got papers now, claiming you sold your water rights. Got signatures from witnesses saying you traded them for debt forgiveness." "But that's not true." Martha Jane's voice shook. "I never signed anything." "Forgery," Silas said, his jaw tight. "Crow's using the law against us." Henry took another sip of coffee. "Worse yet, papers say you ain't fit to keep the little one. Claim you can't provide proper care." Martha Jane's legs went weak. She sank into a chair, her face pale. "They want to take my baby?" The afternoon light was fading when they heard riders approaching. Silas moved to the window, his hand going. To the rifle. 3 men. Deputy Thorne and 2 others. Martha Jane clutched her baby closer, heart pounding as boots thumped on the porch. Deputy Thorne's knock rattled the door. Silas opened it slowly, blocking the entrance with his body. Snow swirled in around Thorne's feet as he stood there, trying to look important in his badge and heavy coat. "Evening," Thorne said, his young face flushed with false authority. "Got some business with Mrs. Callahan." "State your business," Silas said flatly. Thorne pulled papers from his coat. "Got documents here showing she sold her water rights to Mr. Crow last week. Also orders regarding the welfare of the infant." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just doing my duty, ensuring proper care for the child." Martha Jane rose shakily, holding her baby tight. "That's a lie. I never sold anything. Got witnesses who say different." Thorne waved the papers. "Sign here surrendering the claim, and will ensure the child gets proper placement with a respectable family. You're not taking her baby," Silas growled. Thorne's hand moved toward his pistol. "Now see here. You are trespassing." Henry's quiet voice cut through the tension. He stepped from the shadows, his presence commanding respect even from the corrupt deputy. "These are false claims against a widow's legal rights. Leave now." The deputy's confident mask slipped slightly. He looked at his 2 companions, who shifted uneasily in the doorway. "This ain't over," Thorne spat. "We'll be back with more men. That water claim belongs to those who can properly manage it." He jabbed a finger at Martha Jane. "And that child deserves better than a penniless woman who can't even feed herself proper." Martha Jane flinched at the cruel words, but held her ground. "Get out," Silas said, his voice deadly quiet. The men retreated into the swirling snow. They listened as hoofbeats faded into the gathering dusk dot. As soon as they were gone, Martha Jane's legs gave out. She sank to the floor, clutching her baby, great sobs racking her body. "They want to take her, my little girl. Little girl." Silas knelt beside her, his rough hand gentle on her shoulder. "Won't let that happen. Won't let them take either of you." Henry stoked the fire higher, his face troubled. "They'll be back. With more men, official papers. Law don't always protect those who deserve it." "Then we'll protect each other," Silas said firmly, though worry clouded his eyes. They sat late into the night by the fire, the baby sleeping peacefully between them, unaware of the threats gathering like storm clouds. "Martha," Jane hummed softly, trying to keep fear at bay. Silas cleaned his rifle with steady hands. His jaw set with determination. The snow fell thicker outside, blanketing the world in white silence. But inside the cabin, 3 people and a baby formed their own kind of family, bound together by necessity and growing love ready to face whatever morning might bring. Dawn crept over the mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. Inside the cabin, Silas sat at the rough-hewn table, the steady rhythm of whetstone against steel filling the quiet morning. His weathered hands moved with practiced care as he sharpened his axe, pausing occasionally to test the edge with his thumb. Nearby, his rifle lay cleaned and ready, a stark reminder of the threats they faced. Martha Jane hadn't slept more than a few minutes at a time, her mind churning with worry. Dark circles shadowed her eyes as she spooned warm porridge into her daughter's eager mouth. Between bites, her lips moved in silent prayer, whispering verses that had comforted her since childhood. "The Lord is my shepherd," she murmured, watching her baby's innocent face. "I shall not want." Henry arrived as the morning mist was burning away, his breath visible in the cold air. He stamped snow from his boots before entering, bringing the scent of pine and winter with him. "Folk need to know what's happening," Henry said, accepting a cup of coffee from Martha Jane. "Crow feeds on fear and silence. But there are good people in town, people who felt his cruelty themselves." Silas set down his whetstone, considering. Reverend Albright might help. "Man's got influence." "And courage," Henry added. "He speaks truth, even when it costs him." Martha Jane looked up from the baby. "The church ladies have been kind to me lately." "Then we'll ride to town," Silas decided. Today. They set out after noon, the wagon cutting fresh tracks through the snow. Martha Jane held her baby close, wrapped in every blanket they owned. Silas drove carefully, while Henry rode alongside on his paint horse, eyes scanning the quiet landscape. The little white church stood brave against the winter sky. Inside, Reverend Albright listened gravely as they shared their story. The false papers, the threats to take the baby, the deputy's corruption. His kind face grew stern as understanding dawned. "This cannot stand," he said finally. "God's word is clear about protecting widows and orphans. I'll speak at tomorrow's town meeting." Word spread quickly. Other townspeople gathered in the church's warm interior, drawn by the conversation. Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, stepped forward first. "Crow threatened to burn our store when we wouldn't sell," she said. "We've been afraid to speak up, but no more." Others followed, sharing their own stories of intimidation. The blacksmith's daughter brought fresh bread for Martha Jane. The seamstress pressed a hand-knitted blanket into her arms, whispering blessings over the baby. "You're not alone anymore," the Reverend's wife said firmly, squeezing Martha Jane's hand. For the first time in days, Martha Jane felt hope bloom in her chest. These people, with their kind eyes and work-worn hands, were choosing to stand with her. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she thanked them. The afternoon was waning when they started home. In the wagon, Martha Jane sat closer to Silas than usual, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "Never thought I'd have folks willing to fight for me," she said softly. Silas's eyes stayed on the road, but his voice was gentle. "You gave me reason to fight again, to care again." The tender moment shattered as they crested the last hill. Smoke rose thick and black against the darkening sky, too close to their cabin. Henry spurred his horse forward as Silas snapped the reins. "No," Martha Jane whispered, clutching her baby tighter. "Please, no." They rounded the final bend to find their barn engulfed in flames. The dry wood burned hot and fast, sending sparks swirling into the winter air. The heat struck their faces even from a distance. Silas pulled the wagon to a hard stop. "Stay here," he ordered. Jumping down with his rifle ready, Henry was already circling the property, looking for signs of the attackers. But whoever had set the blaze was long gone, leaving only destruction in their wake. Martha Jane watched helplessly as the barn's roof collapsed in a shower of embers. The mule had thankfully been in the corral, but their stored hay, tools, and winter supplies were all being devoured by the hungry flames. "They mean to drive us out," Henry said grimly, returning to the wagon. "Burn us off the land if they have to." Silas stood rigid, watching their barn burn. His face was set in hard lines, but his eyes held a dangerous light. This was no longer just about protecting a widow and her child. Their enemies had declared open war. The baby began to cry, perhaps sensing her mother's distress. Martha Jane rocked her gently, humming a hymn to calm them both, while flames painted the gathering dusk in shades of orange and red. Through the bitter night, Silas and Henry fought the inferno with desperate determination. Bucket after bucket of creek water arced through the darkness, hissing as it struck the flames. Martha Jane stood in the cabin doorway, her baby wrapped tight against the winter chill, watching helplessly as the men battled to save what they could. "Lord, give us strength," she whispered, rocking her daughter as sparks spiraled upward into the star-filled sky. The fire's heat pressed against their faces like an angry hand, turning snow to steam yards from the blaze. Hour after hour, Silas and Henry worked in grim silence, their shoulders aching from the endless hauling of water. The mule paced nervously in its corral, safe but distressed by the chaos when dawn finally broke. Pale and cold, the barn was nothing but smoking ruins. Black timbers jutted from the ashes like broken teeth. The sweet hay that should have lasted through winter lay in sodden, charred heaps. Tools inherited from Silas's father were warped beyond repair. Silas stood amid the destruction, his face streaked with soot, chest heaving from exertion. Rage simmered beneath his exhaustion, not just at the loss, but at the cowardice of men who would burn a widow's shelter. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. Henry looked nearly as worn, his usual steady demeanor strained by the long night's work. "We should check the cabin's walls," he said quietly. "Make sure no embers caught." Inside, Martha Jane had already begun her morning routine, trying to maintain normalcy for the baby's sake. A clear voice lifted in prayer as she worked, asking not for vengeance but for courage to face whatever came next. "Give us wisdom, Lord," she prayed, measuring coffee with shaking hands. "Show us the path through this valley." By mid-morning, word of the fire had spread. The first neighbors arrived bringing armfuls of hay and sacks of feed for the mule. Mrs. Peterson came with fresh bread and sympathy, while the blacksmith's son offered to help salvage what tools he could. Silas watched these acts of kindness with quiet amazement. Years of solitude had made him forget the warmth of community. Each person who trudged through the snow to offer help chipped away at his mountain man's isolation. "We'll stand with you," the miller's wife declared, pressing Martha Jane's hand. "What they did ain't right." As the afternoon wore on, Martha Jane gathered her resolve. Standing in the cabin's doorway, watching more neighbors arrive, she made her decision. "We're going to that town meeting tomorrow," she announced firmly. "And I'm speaking for myself." Silas looked up from where he was sorting through charred lumber. "You sure about that?" "Crow's men will be there, I am sure." Martha Jane's chin lifted. "This is my claim, my baby's future. I won't hide while others fight for me." Pride warmed Silas's chest as he studied her determined face. This wasn't the trembling widow from the auction block anymore. Fire had forged something stronger in her spirit. Evening settled over the homestead, bringing bitter cold. With the darkness inside the cabin, Martha Jane worked in the kitchen space, which still smelled faintly of smoke. Her voice rose sweet and clear in an old hymn as she prepared their supper. The familiar words, a comfort in troubled times. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound," she sang, rolling out biscuits while the baby played contentedly with a wooden spoon at her feet near the hearth. Silas worked with quiet focus, trying to restore some of the damaged tools. The rasp of his file kept time with Martha Jane's singing, while Henry sat nearby, wrapping new handles for the surviving axes. The baby's happy babbling brought small smiles to their tired faces. She crawled between them, untouched by fear, reaching up occasionally to pat their knees with flower-gusted hands. Though the barn's destruction had shaken them, something else had been strengthened in its place. They were no longer just three separate souls sharing space, but a family unit, bound together by adversity and choice. Martha Jane paused in her work, watching Silas gentle with the baby when she tugged at his trouser leg. Her heart swelled with gratitude for this quiet man who had become their protector, their home. "We'll need to leave early tomorrow," Henry reminded them, setting aside his finished work. "Town meeting starts at 10 o'clock. Silas nodded, his expression hardening as he thought of facing their enemies. But Martha Jane's voice was steady when she spoke. "We're ready," she said simply, lifting her chin. "Whatever comes, we face it together." The baby clapped her hands, making them all smile despite their weariness. Outside, the ruins of the barn smoldered in the darkness, but inside the cabin, hope burned brighter than any fire their enemies could light. 2 days after the barn burning, townspeople filed into the whitewashed church, their boots echoing on wooden floorboards. Winter sunlight filtered through frosted windows, casting long shadows across the gathered faces. The usual pews had been pushed back against the walls, transforming the sanctuary into an impromptu meeting hall. Martha Jane sat near the front, her baby sleeping peacefully in a woven shawl. Her hands trembled slightly as she touched the worn letters in her pocket, but her spine remained straight. Silas stood behind her chair like a guardian, his weathered face unreadable. Elias Crow swaggered down the center aisle, Deputy Thorne trailing in his wake. The rancher's boots rang against the floor with deliberate heaviness as he faced the assembled townsfolk. He produced a stack of papers with a flourish, holding them high. "Out here the legal sale of rights," Crow announced, his voice carrying to the rafters. "Signed and witness proper, showing how Widow Callahan sold her claim, fair and square." Deputy Thorne nodded importantly, adjusting his badge. "All according to law," he added, though his eyes skittered away from direct contact. With the crowd, Martha Jane rose slowly to her feet, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "I have something to share as well," she said, drawing out her husband's letters. The papers shook slightly in her grip, but Silas's presence behind her lent strength. She began to read aloud, her voice growing stronger with each word. The letters detailed her husband's careful planning, his dreams for their homestead, his determination to secure water rights legally for their child's future. His integrity shone through every line. "These are his own words," Martha Jane declared, looking up at the gathered faces. "Written in his own hand, showing his honest intent. I never sold those rights. The papers Mr. Crow holds are false." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Henry stepped forward, his quiet dignity commanding attention. He moved to stand beside Martha Jane, his expression grave. "I have seen many treaties broken by false papers," Henry said, his words measured and clear. "Our people know well how the powerful try to take from those they think are weak. The law forbids taking land or rights through fraud. This widow's claim stands firm, just as our treaties should." More whispers filled the church. Martha Jane saw women nodding, men exchanging troubled glances. Crow's face darkened as he felt the mood shifting. What does a fat woman need with water rights? He spat suddenly, his composure cracking. Can't even work the land proper. "Useless waste of good property," gasps erupted from the crowd. Several women pressed hands to their mouths in shock. The preacher's wife stood up, her face flushed with anger. Even Deputy Thorne took a step back from his patron. Looking uncomfortable, Reverend Albright rose from his chair, raising his hands for quiet. "The Lord's house hears the cry of widows and orphans," he proclaimed. "His justice stands with the vulnerable, not with those who would deceive and steal. He fixed Crow with a stern gaze. These letters show truth. The forged sale cannot stand. The deputy tugged at his collar, sweat beading on his forehead despite the winter chill. He looked from Crow to the townspeople, seeing the tide of opinion turn. One by one, neighbors stood to speak. The miller testified to Martha Jane's husband's character. The blacksmith's wife recalled how Crow had tried similar tactics before. The schoolteacher pointed out discrepancies in the supposed sale dates. Martha Jane remained standing through it all, her baby now awake and calm in her arms. Silas never moved from his position behind her, his steady presence a shield against Crow's glares. Finally, the preacher called for a show of hands. Who stands with Widow Callahan's rightful claim? Hands rose throughout the church. First, a few, then dozens. Deputy Thorne watched the display with growing unease, his own hands fidgeting with his gun belt. Crow's face twisted with rage as he watched his scheme crumble. "This ain't over," he snarled, jabbing a finger toward Martha. "Jane, you'll regret this day." He stormed toward the door, spurs jingling angry harmony with his boot heels. The deputy hesitated, then hurried after his patron, leaving the forged papers forgotten on a pew. The assembled townsfolk pressed around Martha Jane, offering congratulations and support. Women clasped their hands. Men nodded respectfully to Silas. Henry smiled quietly, knowing justice had prevailed. At least this once, Martha Jane felt tears of relief threatening, but she held them back. She had stood her ground, defended her rights, protected her child's future. Her late husband would. "I've been proud." "Thank you," she said simply, looking up at Silas. His eyes softened as he gazed down at her and the baby. His family in all but name Dawn painted the Colorado Highlands in pale gold, revealing fresh wagon tracks in the muddy street as townsfolk hurried to share news of yesterday's confrontation. Outside the general store, women gathered in clusters, their breath visible in the crisp morning air as they discussed Martha Jane's courage at the town meeting. "Never seen anyone stand up to Crow like that," whispered the miller's wife, adjusting her shawl, and her with a baby to protect, no less. "The mountain man's given her strength," another woman observed, glancing toward the hills where Silas's cabin stood, though Lord knows what Crow might do next. At the cabin, work had already begun. Silas examined the barn's blackened timbers at first light, marking what could be salvaged. The acrid smell of wet ash still hung in the air, but the ground was firm enough to start clearing debris. Henry arrived on horseback, leading a mule loaded with fresh-cut poles for the frame. "Many hands make light work," Henry said, dismounting. He nodded toward several wagons approaching through the pines. Neighbors were coming, bringing tools and supplies. Martha Jane stood in the doorway, her baby contentedly nursing beneath a warm blanket. She watched in amazement as the preacher's wagon arrived, followed by the blacksmith and his sons. Women brought baskets of bread and stew, setting up a makeshift kitchen near the water pump. "Ain't right what Crow did," the blacksmith declared, rolling up his sleeves. "Time we showed him what community means." Throughout the morning, the work site buzzed with activity. Men cleared charred beams while others began setting new corner posts. Henry's knowledge of local timber proved invaluable as he helped Silas select the strongest logs for the frame. Martha Jane moved among the workers, offering water and thanks, her face glowing with gratitude. By afternoon, the basic structure began taking shape. The preacher's wife organized other women to nail cedar shakes for the roof, while children gathered smaller pieces of kindling. Even the schoolteacher arrived after lessons, bringing a wagon of fresh straw for bedding. "The Lord provides," she told Martha Jane, squeezing her hand, "through the kindness of his people." As the sun began to set, the workers departed with promises to return. The new barn stood partially complete, smaller than before but sturdy, a testament to neighbor helping neighbor. Martha Jane insisted on feeding Silas and Henry before Henry rode home, serving up hot biscuits and beans. Later, as darkness settled over the hills, Martha Jane sat by the fireplace with her Bible open. On her lap, the baby dozed in her arms, tiny fingers curled around the edge of her shawl. Silas added another log to the fire, its warmth pushing back the winter chill. "The Lord is my refuge and my fortress," Martha Jane read softly, her voice steady in the quiet room. "My God, in whom I trust." The familiar words of Psalm 91 filled the cabin with peace. Silas sat in his chair, watching the firelight play across her face. The months of loneliness that had haunted his cabin seemed to fade away, replaced by something warmer, more alive. The simple sound of breathing, Martha Jane's gentle cadence, the baby's tiny sighs, filled spaces that had been empty far. "Too long. You've brought light back," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "Both of you. This place was just shelter before. Now it's becoming home again." Martha Jane looked up, her cheeks coloring at his words. In his weathered face, she saw not just protection, but tenderness. The fear that had gripped her since her husband's death began to loosen its hold. Here, with Silas, she felt truly safe for the first time in months. Outside, snow began to fall, delicate flakes drifting past the window. The white powder slowly covered the scorched earth where the old barn had stood, nature's gentle blessing on their new beginning. The baby stirred, making small, contented sounds as Martha Jane adjusted the blanket. The fire crackled, sending sparks up the chimney. Neither felt the need to speak further, comfortable in the quiet understanding that had grown between them. They were no longer just two wounded souls seeking shelter. They were becoming family, bound by something deeper than circumstance. Martha Jane hummed softly, an old hymn her mother had sung. Silas closed his eyes, letting the melody wash over him. Though danger still lurked in the valley, hope had taken root in their hearts, as sure and steady as the new barn rising from ashes, as pure as the snow blanketing the land in white. Moonlight cast long shadows across the snow as Crow and 4 armed men rode through the pines towards Silas's cabin. Their horses' hooves crunched softly in the fresh powder, steam rising from flared nostrils in the frigid night air. Crow's face twisted with rage and humiliation, his pride still stinging from the town meeting. Henry, who had been watching from the ridge, slipped through the darkness like a shadow. He reached the cabin just ahead of the riders, rapping quickly. On the door, "Silas," he whispered urgently. "They're coming." Inside, Silas moved swiftly, positioning Martha Jane and the baby away from the windows. He reached for his rifle but then paused, a different conviction settling over him. The sound of approaching horses grew louder. Lantern lights suddenly flooded the yard as Crow and his men emerged from the trees, rifles gleaming. "Come out, Mountain Man," Crow shouted. "Time to settle this." Silas stepped onto the porch, deliberately empty-handed. His voice carried clearly through the cold air. "More violence will only shame you further. Crow, you've already lost the town's respect." Martha Jane appeared in the doorway behind him, holding her baby close. Her face showed no fear as she gazed steadily at the mounted men. The baby cooed softly in the tense silence. Suddenly, pinpricks of light appeared among the trees, dozens of lanterns bobbing through the darkness. Henry had warned the townspeople earlier, and now they emerged from all directions, shotguns and rifles ready. The preacher, the blacksmith, farmers, and shopkeepers surrounded Crow's men, their weapons glinting in the lamplight. Crow's head whipped around, counting the odds. His men shifted uneasily in their saddles, realizing they were outnumbered and exposed. Without another word, Crow yanked his horse around and spurred it hard, fleeing into the darkness. His men scattered after him, leaving only hoof prints in the snow. A cheer went up from the townsfolk. Martha Jane's baby laughed at the sound, her tiny voice carrying across the yard. The tension broke like ice in spring, and people crowded onto the porch, clapping Silas on the back and hugging Martha Jane. Henry smiled quietly from the shadows, nodding at the justice of it all. The cabin soon filled with warmth and relief as neighbors brought in food and coffee, celebrating not just victory but the power of standing together. Martha Jane's eyes met Silas's across the crowded room, sharing a moment of profound gratitude for the community that had become their shield. Snow blanketed the town in pristine white that Sunday morning, the church steeple rising like a finger pointing heavenward against the crystal-clear sky. Inside the whitewashed walls, sunlight streamed through frosted windows as Reverend Albright's warm voice led the congregation in amazing grace. Martha Jane stood in the front pew, her baby nestled contentedly against her shoulder. Silas's steady presence beside her felt as natural as breathing now. The same townspeople who had once mocked her size now smiled warmly, their hearts softened by her courage and faith. "Let us give thanks," Reverend Albright proclaimed, "for God's providence in bringing justice to our valley and unity to our community." His eyes met Martha Jane's with fatherly pride as the final hymn faded. Silas turned to face Martha Jane. His weathered hands, so capable with axe and rifle, trembled slightly as he took her smaller ones in his. The congregation fell silent, sensing the weight of the moment. "Martha Jane," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed church, "you and your little one have brought light back into my life. Before God and these witnesses, I pledge to make us a proper family, if you'll have me." Tears sparkled in Martha Jane's eyes as she nodded, unable to speak. The baby reached out to pat Silas's scarred cheek, drawing chuckles from the congregation. Applause erupted, echoing off the wooden walls like thunder. The winter sun hung low as they drove home, painting the snow-covered pines in shades of gold. The rebuilt barn stood proud against the twilight, smoke curling from its chimney where Henry had started the evening fire. Inside, the fresh-cut timber still carried the sweet scent of pine. Henry joined them for supper, bringing a brace of rabbits and stories that made Martha Jane laugh. The cabin glowed with warmth as Silas sat by the fire, carefully whittling a small wooden horse. His knife moved surely over the wood, bringing the toy to life while Martha Jane hummed Rock of Ages and stirred the stew. In the corner stood a cradle Silas had fashioned from aspen wood, its curves smooth and loving. The baby slept there now, tiny fingers curled around the blanket made by the church quilting circle. Firelight danced across their faces, the mountain man who had found his heart again, the widow who had reclaimed her dignity, and their trusted friend who had helped justice prevail. Outside, snow began falling once more, but inside the cabin, love had kindled a warmth no winter could touch. Martha Jane gazed at her sleeping daughter. There at Silas, her heart full of gratitude. Here was the home she had prayed for, built on mercy and sustained by grace. Thanks for spending a moment here with me. If this story touched you, let's keep this connection going. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.